Good morning. Good morning. It's a great pleasure to see all of you in this on this morning, this very cold and chilly morning in Leuven. As you know, we have a special guest this morning. It's a great pleasure to welcome Professor Michael Smith from Warwick University here in Leuven. Professor Smith has been with us in several courses, actually, in the Master of European Studies over the last years, sharing his great expertise and knowledge with us, especially in the field of EU international affairs and relations. He has worked for many years on the topic of the EU's foreign policy, as some would call it, but also the interactions with, and that makes his work very special, with other actors, especially the United States, and most recently also China, India, you've been focusing on a great deal. And most of what Professor Smith has worked on is very important in the sense that he brings together, as so few others, the conceptual rigorousness and the empirical evidence and openness for empirical research. So it's a great pleasure to have Professor Smith with us on this morning. It's a special lecture in the sense that, as you know, in this blog number 3 of the TGPE course, we are looking into crisis. We're looking into the crisis of the liberal international order and try to situate what could be a response of the European Union to it. We had a second lecture by Ragnar Weiland, who looked into whether it is actually a crisis situation, whether these crisis situations are actually not a part of European integration, and in that sense there is not that much to worry about. And now finally we look into the question of, well, how do actors like the EU, like the United States and China actually react? How do they shape the new international environment? Something that you can read it in the title, may be called their conditional multilateral engagement. And I'm very much looking forward to the lecture of Professor Smith. A big round of applause. And I'm just saying we go non-stop. You can ask questions at any time, but there will be ample opportunity for Q&A by the end of the lecture for all of you. So prepare your questions. 2 more remarks. For those of you who have not yet paid for the EPA trip, please pay on Friday during the seminars. It's very important. All of you who have registered should also pay. It's very important for us. Otherwise, the bus trip will be too expensive for all of us. And last but not least, next week on Tuesday, we have an internship session for all of you scheduled with alumni who have found internships in the European Commission, in the Committee of the Regions, etc. So please sign up for that or just show up, and afterwards there will be drinks next Tuesday evening. That should be it from my side. It's up to you. The floor is yours, Mike.
Thanks very much, Collier. There's no clock in this room, at least as far as I can see. So that's why periodically I might just touch my phone to see what it tells me the time is. And as Collier said, if I gave this lecture straight off, it would probably take about 45 minutes, 50 minutes. I will pause at the end of each sort of major section so that if anybody's got anything they want to ask me or talk about at that particular point, anything particularly urgent, they can do that, because obviously answering questions and getting into discussion is quite often much more interesting than a lecture. It's very good to be back in Leuven again. It always seems to be quite cold and sunny when I'm in Leuven, so that's good. And it's good to be talking about a topic which relates very strongly not only to what you're studying, but also to one of the research projects in the Global Governance Centre, the Connectivity Project. And I've just spent a good couple of hours with the PhD students who are working on that project, exchanging views on the issues we're wrestling with in the context of global governance and the changing situation in the global arena. This lecture relates quite strongly to some of the themes that are raised in that connectivity project and in your course, particularly in the case of the project connectivity, the way in which different actors within the global arena relate to each other, contestation, the way in which they develop different ways of looking at global governance and at global processes, and to a certain extent at least, cooperation, although one of the messages of the lecture is that cooperation these days is taking place, if it takes place, in remarkably different conditions from cooperation in the recent or more distant past. So what this is doing, and Collier's already indicated that, is bringing together a number of strands in work that I've done over the past few years. And in that sense, it's a kind of a new project. There's a paper that I wrote on this a little while ago, which has been circulated. Collier's got copies of that paper. But this lecture is not simply a repetition of that paper, because this is, in a way, work in progress. As you'll see, it ends with a lot of questions rather than a lot of answers, I'm afraid. But I hope they're the right questions. What I'm going to do first of all is show you a few images. And this is an image of multilateralism at work, in a way. It's the Paris Climate Change Conference, which produced the Paris Accords, which, of course, have been variously implemented, partly implemented, or rubbished, depending on which country you're talking about in relation to them. And it's clearly, this is a global, universal multilateralism event. One of a series of events, of course, in the climate change area. Here's another image. This is a different set of suspects, so to speak. This is the G20, the 20 largest economies in the world, although some have disputed which are the 20 largest economies, and there's obviously a boundary problem between the 20th and the 21st, which is significant. And clearly, you know, you could argue, well, it's still multilateralism, but it's multilateralism among 20 countries and entities rather than multilateralism on a global, universal scale. This is another example of multilateralism. Some people would call intensive multilateralism, the chamber of the Council of the European Union. And obviously we're talking here about perhaps what's the most intensive multilateral relationship and set of institutions in the global arena on a continuing basis amongst a relatively limited number of countries, currently 28, perhaps soon to be 27. And we may come back to that in questions at some point. Clearly, you know, this is, again, a relatively limited form of multilateralism among a group of like-minded countries, so to speak, but one which is undoubtedly in most people's minds would be construed as multilateral. You know, it's a relationship between a many or relatively large number of countries on a continuous basis. Here's another one. Now, some people would say here we're getting into the realms of minilateralism. This is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, their summit in this year. And clearly, here you've got a relatively small number of countries. Two countries that dominate, as you can see. There's Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin in the middle of this, plus a number of Central Asian republics and so on. Now, many people would say here we're talking about plurilateralism or minilateralism among half a dozen, 6 or 7 countries in a particular region of the world, very large region, of course, if you include China and Russia, but one which is in some way different from the multilateralism of the Paris Climate Summit, or even the multilateralism of the European Union or the G20. And the last one. Now, has this got anything to do with multilateralism? You could say this is an absolute paradigm case of bilateralism. And you'd be right in many ways. And we'll come later to the way in which this does relate to an idea of multilateralism. But clearly the United States, North Korea, so effective nuclear summit, so to speak, in itself is a bilateral relationship, but of course has quite strong implications for a major multilateral regime, the non-proliferation regime, and the way in which nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction are handled within the international arena. Okay, so that's just to give you an idea of some of the range of things that we might be talking about if we're talking about multilateralism. And obviously it's an idea which is almost entirely based on numbers rather than on the scope or reach of the types of negotiations or discussions that are taking place. Clearly, this range is of concern, and the balance between these different types of multilateral or bilateral or minilateral events and processes is a concern. And it's a concern to Federica Mogherini, now no longer, of course, or not for very long, the High Representative of the European Union in foreign and security policy. And I'm not going to read this all out, but this is an extract from her speech to EU ambassadors. Every year, I think it's every year, maybe every 6 months, there's a meeting of all the ambassadors of the EU in Brussels, and this is her speech in September, I think it was September this year, could be September last year, but it probably was very much the same. What she's talking about here is the idea that we're moving through a moment of flux, a moment of what she describes as chaos. Chaos, in some people's minds, would be a bit of an extreme way of putting it, but elements of chaos clearly exist in the world that we are living in at the moment. Her argument is about whether this is a long-term trend or whether it's a purely conjunctural, short-term set of events. What she's though stating is that the European Union is on one side of this argument, that the European Union is very strongly on the side of multilateralism rather than the more limited ideas, interests and principles and values that are expressed in bilateralism and various forms of minilateralism. And as she said, she sees a return to the logic of bilateral transactions between powers, if not between individual leaders. And of course the Trump and North Korea situation is very much a personal type of relationship between individual leaders. A situation where might makes right and the world is split in spheres of influence. This is not our logic, and many others in the world do not want to go this way, but some do, at least according to her. This is not our logic. That's a very important statement. The idea is that the European Union acts in international relations with a certain logic which leads it towards multilateral solutions and multilateral practices rather than towards bilateralism and implicitly a politics based on power, or what some people these days, recovering ideas from the past, are calling increasingly geopolitics or geoeconomics. The argument I've got in this lecture is more not that there's an EU logic which is multilateralism and then there are all the other logics which are not. The argument I'm going to put forward is that there are a set of competing or coexisting logics of multilateralism in the international arena at the current time. And in effect there's a kind of spectrum of multilateralisms, not a single multilateral system or a single multilateral set of ideas and principles. And I'm obviously going to illustrate that by reference to the EU, the US and China, but remember actually these are only three, maybe three very important, but three representatives of a really quite large sample. What I'm going to talk about is this, half a dozen things basically. Going to talk about multilateralism and its relationship to the various contexts of global politics, and we've talked a bit about that already, so I can get through that fairly quickly. Talk about its relationship to global governance, because obviously multilateralism is seen as a key part of the liberal international order that Collier mentioned in his introduction. Talk about the particular challenge of negotiation of declarations, of guidelines, of action plans, and so on at various levels. And multilateralism and global governance are heavily centered on the idea that there should be continuous negotiation. But the problem in many cases is whether that negotiation can actually lead to agreements, and agreements that are recognized as legitimate. Another function of diplomacy in global governance is advocacy. The idea that you're not just deliberating, you're not just exchanging ideas, but you're actually fighting for particular ideas and on behalf of particular constituencies. This leads in large numbers of global governance areas to the formation of coalitions, of alliances and partnerships. And the EU, for example, is very big on the idea of partnerships, either interregional partnerships or partnerships with major participants in global governance as part of their approach to the regulation of the international arena and the establishment of international order. These are ways in which you can reduce the complexity of negotiating among large numbers of participants. The problem is, of course, that quite often they become a way of exercising power and of creating dominant coalitions or dominant alliances within international organizations or negotiations. A key aspect of diplomacy in global governance is the exercise of legitimacy and the exercise of leadership. And the question of whether particular countries or particular groups of countries are capable of leading, and the assumptions that that leads to in terms of their involvement in global governance and the way in which they conduct their diplomacy is clearly another part of the equation, so to speak. And of course, the ultimate test of global governance and global governance diplomacy is implementation. Can you actually do what you say you're going to do, or people have apparently agreed to do? Can you actually enforce it in ways that create new practices in international governance and international relations? Now, this is not a lecture about diplomacy. I hope you can see, though, that in the current circumstances, all of those elements about who should be involved, how they should be involved, how they should communicate, how they should negotiate, whether there's a leader or a follower or whatever, all of those are under challenge. They're all challenged because the nature of the international arena is in flux, and the ways in which global governance institutions and multilateralism as a foundation of those global governance institutions operate are in question. They are, some people would argue, in a mode of crisis. Has anybody got any? Yeah.
I would like to ask, in relation to qualitability and principles, it kind of reminds me of how security regional cooperations are measured in quality, and I'm not seeing one aspect is whether multilateralism is more reliant on a positive sum word or a zero-sum word in general. There is a correlation between these.
The question is multilateralism more dependent upon positive sum politics, so to speak, or zero-sum politics? And my answer would be it relies very heavily on assumptions about positive sum politics. The idea that the process of cooperation, the process of multilateralism, if it works effectively, produces benefits for everyone involved. It may not produce equal benefits for everyone involved, but the point is that those involved believe that they're engaged in a process which produces benefits that are generalizable and for the common good. And that's the underpinning not only of multilateralism but also of global governance itself. The idea that things may be difficult, There may be winners and losers in any particular negotiation or any particular set of practices, but that in the end, in a very general sense, things balance out. There is a positive gain. In a zero-sum world, which is the world of what some people might call transactional diplomacy as opposed to multilateral diplomacy, you've got a different set of calculations. There are winners and losers, and if you lose big. And if you win big. Now, I'm not describing anybody's diplomacy in particular here, but there are certain examples at the minute where you might see those principles as being expressed or operating. Okay, what I've said so far, as I said, adds up to the idea that multilateralism is in crisis. That we're faced with a series of challenges to multilateralism which create a sense of crisis and a sense of the loss of capacity in multilateral processes. And Jean Pisani-Ferry in 2018 produced a paper on, I think it's called Should We Give Up on Global Governance? This is for the Bruegel think tank. And he talked about 5 roadblocks constituting a crisis in multilateralism and global governance. And I've talked about all of these in various ways. First was geopolitics, the idea that we're in a world now where there is a kind of win-lose situation and a contest between power blocks. The second thing he talked about was what he called second thoughts on globalization. In other words, the idea that the winners and losers from globalization are kind of giving up on it, particularly some of the people who see themselves as losers, and that it's a retreat from globalization. This is where the idea these days of deglobalization occurs. The third is the obsolescence of institutions and rules, the idea that things are just worn out. A lot of these organizations, not all of them by any means, but a lot of them were established in the 1940s and 1950s, and despite adaptations, it may simply be that they're worn out. They don't have the capacity to create rules, to create legitimacy, and to apply those rules and legitimacy anymore. The fourth thing he talks about is imbalances, and the particular imbalances he has in mind are between domestic politics or economics and international politics and economics. In other words, the idea that domestic forces these days are increasingly at odds with the notion of international cooperation and management. Unless, of course, it's on terms that those domestic forces think are good terms. So the idea that there's a sort of general commitment to the overall good of the international arena seems to have been challenged, at least, by the idea that domestic politics are what counts, that you listen, first of all, not to the international audience, but to the domestic audience. And simply increased complexity. The idea that you now have areas in which simply gathering information is a difficult task in itself, and after that trying to manage things is increasingly complex, demanding, and increasingly beyond the competence of global governance institutions. And what Pisani-Ferry says is that as a result, there is a search for new forms of governance, what he calls voluntary commitment. In other words, what some people have also called a club approach to international governance. Limited numbers with their own rules and so on. Flexibility, variable geometry of institutions. You like some, you don't like others. All of these contribute to what I would describe, and what I'm now going to talk about in relation to the EU, the US and China, as conditional multilateralisms. In other words, multilateralism is in crisis, but people still talk about it an awful lot. The problem is they're talking about different kinds of multilateralisms, and they're talking about multilateralisms based on different sets of assumptions and principles. And that's where you get the comparison between the EU, the US, and China that I'll move on to in a second. Has anybody got any further questions about what I've said so far? Yeah, you'll have to speak up.
I'll try. Haven't also the geopolitics tried to explain increase complexity of the world, because there is a strand of geopolitics that tries to explain certain issues. Does this influence any world leaders that right now we adhere mostly to classical geopolitics?
I think I heard, how much does geopolitics actually affect the...
How much geopolitics affects the perceptions of world leaders, and how do you take this?
Yep, okay. Well, a lot of people would argue these days, especially in the last few months, that geopolitics has thoroughly infiltrated even the European Union, which historically has been seen by its practitioners, so to speak, as not really connected with geopolitics in the very direct sense. I think it's very clear that we're not quite necessarily back to the years before the First World War, when geopolitics was first came a big theory. But that geopolitical considerations lie at the center of a lot of leaders' approaches to international relations, very clearly at the basis of the Trump administration's approach, clearly at the basis of Chinese approach, and you might argue that both the Americans and the Chinese have never really given up on geopolitics, so it's not really a new thing. Very clearly at the basis of Russian policy. But the most telling thing is, in many ways, the idea that the EU has now become, or would like to become, its leaders would like to become a practitioner of geopolitics. The new president of the European Commission has said that she wants it to be a geopolitical commission. In other words, a commission which is organized around the need to pay attention to particular regions of the world and to the power balances within those regions. Other people have argued really quite recently that the European Union, now is the time for the European Union to become much more of a power. Power in quotes, but much more of an ordinary kind of power. And the development of European Union security and defense policy, the development of the European Union foreign and security policy, as well as other areas of EU external action, has led people to argue that that's what's happening. Previously, it could be argued that the European Union had powers, but was not a power in the sense of, one of these poles in a multipolar world. But actually, if you went back to the early 1970s, as I did earlier on, Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger were talking about the European Union, or the European Community as it was then, as one of the 5 great poles of power in the world. So maybe that's not a new thing, but it's certainly new in terms of the way in which people in the European Commission and elsewhere are talking about the international role of the European Union. So it may not be classical geopolitics, and in a world where lots of processes that occur ignore national boundaries, and that's a discussion we had earlier on with members of the Connectivity Project, you're dealing with it in a new context, but there's this new focus on geopolitics and geopolitical winners and losers in the international arena. And that's very much to do with the perceptions of individual leaders and the way they speak about the geopolitical consequences of their actions, or the geopolitical forces operating on their actions. Let me just check the time. Okay. let's talk about conditional multilateralisms. You remember I said that what we have is a world of conditional multilateralisms, not a world of conditional multilateralism as a generalized concept. And that's really important because we're dealing with approaches to perspectives on multilateralism that go beyond the idea that there's some sort of blanket multilateral forms and multilateral processes. The EU has an image as a compulsive multilateralist. In other words, you don't do anything very much in your external actions unless it's covered by a multilateral mandate or occurs within a multilateral context or is shaped by multilateral rules and conventions. And this is said to reflect its foundations. You know, the idea that the EU itself is an example of intensive multilateralism, and that is being exported. It's projected into the international arena. But there's always been a more instrumentalist view, which is that actually being multilateralist suits the European Union. It suits European interests. It contributes to stability. It contributes to predictability. It gives the European Union a voice which it might not otherwise have. That's the way the European Union has developed its international identity, predominantly through multilateral institutions and operating on a multilateral mandate, even in areas of security and defence policy. So those two things are really important. It's part of the EU's self-image, but it's also part of the EU's instrumental interests and needs. The latest attempt to square this circle between values and principles and what you actually need is the EU's global strategy from 2016, which made a big play of the way in which the European Union was going to operate on the basis of what it called principled pragmatism. Now, how you bring principle and pragmatism together is a continuing source of tensions. This is embodied in the idea that the EU likes to put forward of effective multilateralism, that what the EU is interested in is using multilateral institutions to produce practical policy, to produce policy that actually shapes the world and also, incidentally, of course, benefits the European Union. This has been re-emphasised this year. The European Council produced conclusions which have led to various forms of action and programmes and so on, which said that we want to reinvigorate multilateralism. To use their words, we want to reform, deepen and create multilateralism. The idea that you can actually create multilateralism is an interesting one. Not quite sure how they intend to go about it. And a few weeks ago I did a training course for the European External Action Service, which was all about multilateralism. And it wasn't any clearer at the end than it was at the beginning what they meant by creating multilateralism. But it's a rededication to multilateralism, right? But at the same time, you've got the European Commission saying we're going to be a geopolitical commission, and others saying the European Union should make itself into a power. Now, the two things are not incompatible, but they are quite difficult to balance. This means that what you have in many ways is the growth of contingent multilateralism. Multilateralism in principle, but then it all depends on the context. It all depends on who you're dealing with, who you're operating with. And this reflects the broader changes in the world arena, power shifts, different kinds of pressures on member states, and the limitations of resources for the EU and for multilateral organisations. So, European Union, to my mind, is no longer, if it ever was, a compulsive multilateralist. It's a conditional multilateralist, and we know what the conditions are. The conditions are that it should coincide with European Union interests, that it should lead to the kind of stable and orderly international processes with which the European Union feels comfortable, but also that it should satisfy internal, domestic European Union audiences. And that is becoming much more difficult because, as you all know, those domestic audiences in the EU don't necessarily agree on everything to do, not with everything, not necessarily just multilateralism, but more generally. So some people would argue, therefore, that the European Union itself faces a series of internal and other challenges, and that is what conditions or shapes its a new approach to multilateralism, which is essentially one that is qualified, conditional in various ways. Anybody have any questions about the EU? Or shall we save it till the end? I'll carry on. Oh, carry on.
Sorry, to make a distinction between the EU and its member states, because certainly France and the UK stay inside, and Germany, they have their own interests. So this, if we have one European power, that would mean like a federal state of Europe. That would simplify the context, and we would have continental powers like the US and China, etc. If we had the EU as 30,000 civil servants with 1% of the budget creating an additional power, that would complicate perhaps things.
I think complicate is a rather mild way of putting it, actually. Yeah. And that is one of the sources of the tensions and the contradictions in EU policy at the moment. That you also have EU member states, and it's not just Britain, France, and Germany. Countries like Sweden, would consider themselves leaders in multilateralism of a particular kind, and then you also have other countries, Hungary, for example, which would not take the same view of multilateralism at all. So actually the problem of internal consensus in the EU, of internal dynamics, is one which is strongly conditioning and will continue to strongly condition its approach to multilateralism. Incidentally, of course, my own country says that after Brexit, it is going to be one of the undisputed leaders in multilateralism and the multilateral system. Well, we'll see. We can talk about that maybe in Q&A when I get to it. Let's talk about the USA for a few minutes. Although I could talk about the USA for hours, but for a few minutes. The United States has always been a selective multilateralist, right? Just because the Trump administration has taken a certain approach to this doesn't mean that it's unprecedented. For example, in 1948, the United States defeated the agreement on the International Trade Organization because it was considered an inappropriate intrusion into US domestic politics. And that's one of the reasons why until 1995 we had the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade rather than an international or World Trade Organization. The Nixon administration, which I've talked about rather too much, I suppose, the Nixon administration itself reshaped the multilateral system by abandoning parts of the Bretton Woods system, the idea that the dollar was the stake or the principal currency in the world. It may still be, but it's not on the same terms as it was before 1970 or 71. There's a long tradition of this, and I'm not trying, by talking about the long tradition of selective multilateralism in the US, to normalize what the Trump administration is doing. I'd be the last person to do that. But I think you can actually see that it's not unprecedented. Very awkward word, the word domesticism. The idea that the United States comes first, and the idea that American policy internationally is a projection of what goes on domestically, is not unprecedented. America First is not Donald Trump's slogan. It's been around for many decades. Making America Great Again is not Donald Trump's slogan. It was one of Ronald Reagan's slogans in the 1980s. So it's not unprecedented. And generally, these kinds of tensions in American policy have been contained within the broad commitment to the liberal international order. And of course, the liberal international order depended very heavily on the United States commitment and the exercise of hegemony, dominance, in a way which allowed for the development of multilateralism. Another thing you have to add into the equation is the context of US decline and the ways in which the loss of American dominance has in itself eroded a particular type of multilateralism. A lot of the multilateralism that we see as operating up to the 1980s and 1990s was under the umbrella of American hegemony. And the question is, can multilateralism survive in the United States or elsewhere if that hegemony is challenged and America is in decline? That's not unprecedented either. Back at the end of the 1980s, there was an terminal pessimism in American politics about the status of the United States in the world. The idea of declinism, as it came to be known, was very pervasive. But there is a changing global structure which almost immediately after that mood of decline in the late 1980s began to change with the end of the Cold War, obviously, and of course later, pretty much the same time really, the emergence of China. Trump administration, though, does have its own particular twist on this. There's a great deal of continuity in what the Trump administration has done, but there's also a great deal of discontinuity in the way in which it's been expressed and channeled through the president and his personal relationships with other leaders. This has led to the idea that the Americans unprecedentedly have become committed to this idea of transactional diplomacy, the idea that it's all about the deal. That it doesn't matter about permanent institutions or values or anything like that. It's just what you can agree on and what you bring to the table. And that's something that very clearly grows out of the Trump experience and about the Trump backstory, if you like. And it's something which challenges the idea that you can build stable foundations and sustainable foundations for global governance. As I mentioned earlier on, American officials have argued that this leads to a new form of international order based on multiple bilateralisms and multiple deals. But if you're concluding deals on the basis that no previous deal matters and that no future deal matters, then it's difficult to see how this can lead to a sustainable form of multilateralism. But there is some conflicting evidence. The United States does remain committed to some forms of multilateralism. And of course, in the United States, there is a strong groundswell of opposition to the Trump administration. One of the grounds for that opposition is multilateralism rather than bilateralism and personalism in diplomacy. And we shall see in November next year whether that groundswell has the capacity to topple the Trump administration. But we'll also see, even if the Trump administration doesn't get a second term, whether there's a reversion to some form of liberal multilateralism. I doubt whether there would be. If Hillary Clinton had been president, it's not clear that there would have been a reversion to some form of liberal multilateralism. And the Obama administration itself was not a practitioner in all circumstances of liberal multilateralism. Third example, China. in the paper that goes along with this lecture, I characterized China as an experimental multilateralist. In other words, it's come relatively late to multilateral institutions and multilateral practices, since the middle of the 1990s in effect, and is trying them on for size to see which of them benefit and which of them don't benefit it, and to see what it can get out of them. Now you may say that's purely instrumental, but it's also a bit more than that, because in a sense, in the same way as the EU, involvement in multilateral institutions is a source of legitimacy and a source of influence for the Chinese. And you've seen several speeches by Chinese leaders, particularly Xi Jinping, expressing their adherence to multilateralism and the need to preserve the multilateral system. And that is, in many ways, because the Chinese get particular benefits out of the multilateral system. One of those is status and legitimacy, the recognition that China is a major force in the international economy in particular. But it doesn't do away with the tensions that exist between China as an economy and as a political system and the existing international regimes. An example of this, the Chinese badly want to get market economy status in the World Trade Organization, but this comes up against the fact that the European Union, but particularly the United States, won't grant it market economy status in the World Trade Organization. So that China is still, in effect, classed as a developing country. And in many ways, of course, that's what it is. It's an emerging economy with a very large economy, but still some limitations on the extent to which it's a fully developed economy. Same goes for the Chinese currency, the renminbi, and its status in the International Monetary Fund. The ways in which the United States, of course, sees the Chinese as currency manipulators, but the International Monetary Fund has had to respond to the size of the Chinese economy by enlarging its quota within the IMF, which also enlarges its voting rights within the IMF. So it's a transitional situation. The World Trade Organization, the commitment to multilateralism more generally, has in many ways a more defensive aspect to it. The championing of the multilateral order that I talked about just now is in many ways a defensive approach, particularly in the light of American challenges for the Chinese economy. But what the Chinese have done is look for new forms of multilateralism. And this goes back to what Pisani-Ferry was saying. You know, if you're fed up and you think the current institutions are in crisis, you look for new forms. And the Chinese have looked for several new forms. One of them is the way in which the Belt and Road Initiative, the Chinese initiative to bring development and various other benefits to large numbers of countries between China and Europe, has been developed. And you may say, is that multilateralism, or is it a kind of hub and spoke bilateralism? In other words, China is the center and then there are spokes emanating to various other countries. Another way of looking at it is through the organization that we mentioned at the start, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is a minilateral organization in which obviously China and the Russians are key members and which serves regional and continental objectives of the Chinese and the Russians. So the question with China is it engaged in multilateralism simply as an instrumental device, because it provides certain benefits and certain areas of influence, or is there some process of socialization going on, which means that the Chinese have become multilateralists, sometimes against their will, almost, in the course of being engaged in institutions and various sorts of international regimes. Now, the point about this is, what I've described to you is three forms of conditional multilateralism. The European Union, which although it might think of itself as a compulsive multilateralist, is definitely a conditional multilateralist. The United States, which some people might say has abandoned multilateralism, but to my mind is still a highly conditional multilateralist. And the Chinese, who have become introduced into the processes of multilateralism and remain conditional multilateralists, searching for ways in which multilateralism can benefit them, as well as providing a stable global environment. What this means, and this is a set of questions which I'm not going to talk about in any detail at all, which simply arise from what I've said. If you've got a world of competing conditional multilateralisms, how do you organise it? How can you balance multilateralism and different forms of bilateralism or regionalism? How can existing institutions be adapted? How can they learn, become learning organisations? We already see that existing institutions are suffering from this kind of tension. How can new stakeholders be involved? How can they be incorporated? How far is power going to be the currency of multilateralism rather than trust, reciprocity, and so on? Is there a new need for new ways of expressing and aggregating preferences? In other words, bringing people together and getting them to agree. Are we seeing the emergence of new coalitions, partnerships, and alliances? Well, I think in many cases we are. How can new forms of norm be applied and observed? And what types of reforms might be proposed? Now, I've got any answers to those things, or no answers beyond what I've already said. But I think the point to remember is that in a world of competing multilateralisms and competing conditional multilateralisms, which are not, classic or absolute forms of multilateralism, you have to think about the extent to which this would be a stable, manageable, sustainable world. Would it be a world in which multilateralism became a much more sort of strategic, geopolitical and geoeconomic approach? Or would it be a world of fragmentation and conflict? And the answer to that is not in my hands. The answer is in the hands of those who have to deal with the future and the present, because you can see quite clearly that we're in between these kind of possibilities. And my argument here would be that these are possibilities that reflect the growth of conditional multilateralisms and the kinds of forces that those express. And I've gone on for too long, and I'm sorry about that, but we can perhaps have a few minutes for discussion. Maybe 40 minutes. half an hour anyway. Okay. Do people want to use this if they want to ask questions, or? I think you can probably make yourselves heard. Has anybody got questions? Right, we've got one here in the front and one over there. Can we take you first and then you?
You alluded to the United Kingdom's exit from the European Union, and it's some people's aspirations for a so-called global Britain, and that Britain can be a leader in multilateral, or can be a leader in multilateralism. Do you think there's a silver lining to Brexit in any way? I mean, I have to tell myself then I'll